Hello and welcome to Study Sessions. My name is Mr. Boff. In this episode of Baughcuts, we're taking a close but brief look at the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Remember, these episodes are structured around the approach we need in the exam. We're going to be thinking about the poem's title, and then we're going to be looking at three key quotations from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the poem to support our analysis and understanding. So let's get into that title. Now, the title, My Last Duchess, is a really concise and yet profound entry point, if you will, into Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, because it so neatly encapsulates the poem's broader themes of possession, control, and patriarchal authority. Let's start with that first word, the possessive pronoun my. It's a word that immediately establishes the Duke's proprietary attitude towards his wife. It's a word that reflects that Victorian era norm where women were often viewed as possessions of their husbands. Remember, although this poem is not set in the Victorian period, it is written within the Victorian period. And so I think we can read it as a critique of some of those social norms. It is a possessiveness that, of course, is emphasized and reinforced and explored elsewhere throughout the rest of the poem, where, for example, the Duke reveals that he alone is the only one permitted to draw the curtain over the Duchess's portrait, a symbol really of his control over her, even in death. And then we move on in the title to that adjective, last. It's a word that introduces ambiguity. It could denote the most recent in a series, suggesting the Duke has had multiple wives. Or it could imply finality, hinting that the Duchess is the last due to her demise. This ambiguity underscores the Duke's objectification of his wife. It reduces her to merely a replaceable entity within a broader sequence. This is my last Duchess. I'm thinking about the next one. Now, final word, Duchess. By referring to her solely by her title, not her actual name, the Duke strips her of personal identity. And that really reinforces one of the key themes of the poem, which is the objectification of women. It aligns with the poem's broader critique of how women were often valued more for their social standing and their usefulness than for their individuality. So if we put all of them back together collectively, My Last Duchess, it encapsulates the Duke's patriarchal, authoritarian disposition, but also the societal norms that Robert Browning is critiquing that have enabled that kind of dominance. It sets the stage then for a dramatic monologue and a narrative that delves into the dangers of unchecked power, particularly unchecked male power, and the dehumanization that can result from perceiving individuals as mere possessions to be controlled and dominated. We're now going to move on to the section of the podcast where we look at the three quotations. And we're going to start with a crucial line right at the very beginning of the poem. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Now, these opening lines of the dramatic monologue, obviously spoken by the Duke, casually introduce a portrait of his former, as we'll learn later, now deceased wife. That phrase, my last Duchess, obviously echoing the title, is revealing. My demonstrates that possessive nature. She's one of his possessions. Last hints at the sense that he's had multiple duchesses, or at least he's planning on a new wife. He's showing this portrait to an envoy arranging his next marriage. The fact that she's painted on the wall and looking as if she were alive immediately tells us that she's no longer alive. The portrait is all that remains of her in his home. There's a chilling irony in as if she were alive, because we very soon infer that later on in the poem, it becomes clear, perhaps, that the Duke has orchestrated her death. It's a quote then that introduces those themes of patriarchal power and objectification. The Duke controls how the Duchess is seen now, literally controlling who gets to look at her portrait behind a curtain, and narratively controlling her story as he speaks about her, and obviously she can't say anything. Browning uses some dramatic irony. The Duke's offhand tone belies the dark story behind the painting, which the reader gradually pieces together. The Duke's pride is evident. He calls the piece a wonder, he's showing it off. In doing so, he reduces his late wife to a piece of art, a trophy on the wall, illustrating how his authority and ego treated her not as a partner, but as a kind of collectible. Themes of patriarchal power, jealousy, and control are encapsulated here. She is forever frozen alive in art, where he can admire her beauty without any of the behavior that once displeased him. The phrase also sets the stage for the poem's exploration of the Duke's character, refined on the surface, but possessing a sinister need for dominance. In short, then, it's a quote that immediately signals to the reader that the Duke speaks of his deceased wife in a disturbingly detached and possessive way, highlighting the poem's core message about the corrupting nature of power and of pride. Next quotation. Too easily impressed, she liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. In these lines, the Duke describes what he saw as the Duchess's flaw, her friendliness and appreciation for all that she encountered. Too easily impressed suggests that she was delighted by simple things or by anyone's courtesy, which to the Duke is a fault because he expected her admiration to be reserved for him and his status. She liked whate'er she looked on means, on one level, she found joy, from his perspective that is, she found joy in everything. Whether it's a sunset, a pretty flower, a kind gesture from someone, she responds with happiness. And her looks went everywhere implies that she did not avert her gaze or restrain her smile. She treated all with equal warmth. From the Duke's perspective, this was unacceptable because it diminishes his own importance. These lines highlight the Duke's jealousy and pride. He couldn't stand that my favour at her breast was valued by her the same as any other trivial compliments or gifts from others. The tone here, though it's delivered in terms of the tone and how it sounds and feels to us, though it's delivered in the Duke's polite, controlled manner, drips with condescension, irritation, and possibly a degree of even actual sexual jealousy and irritation. Browning uses enjambment and pauses throughout, notice that semicolon after impressed, to convey the Duke's controlled anger. Thematically, this quote touches on power and control. The Duke felt entitled to dictate his Duchess's emotions and social interactions. Her failure to exclusively revere his 900-year-old name becomes, in his mind, a form of disloyalty. It also sheds light on the conflict between innocence and authoritarianism, the Duchess's generous spirit versus the Duke's tyrannical expectations. He refers to her positive qualities, being easily pleased, kind, joyful, in a negative way, because they challenge and undermine his ego. It reveals the poem's critique of aristocratic arrogance. The Duke values pride and control over genuine human warmth. In essence, then, these lines show the reader how unreasonable and, indeed, perhaps sexually possessive the Duke is, foreshadowing the drastic steps he took to stop those looks of hers. It is an action driven by the need to assert power over a free-spirited individual. Now, I've mentioned sexual jealousy a couple of times, and that's because it is possible to read this quotation too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere, as rather euphemistic. It could be conveying the sense that, from his perspective, she is sexually interested in others, that she is flattered by the attention of other men. Now, it's euphemistic because obviously he's not directly saying this. Everything is rather coyly expressed. Her looks went everywhere. What does that really mean? There is a powerful ambiguity here. But whether she is straightforwardly just joyful, okay, easily pleased, or perhaps there is maybe a germ of truth to his sexual jealousy, that maybe she was, to a certain extent, interested in other men, regardless, this is a poem and this is a line that is kind of dripping with jealousy and that desire to possess and control, to dominate, okay? We move on. Next quotation, final quotation. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Now, I think that this is arguably the most chilling line in the poem, and it is delivered with cold brevity by the Duke. I gave commands is yet another euphemism in a poem full of euphemisms. He doesn't spell out the deed, but the implication is clear. That is, that he ordered the Duchess's death or sent her away to some kind of living death. The very vagueness and calmness of the statement highlights his absolute power and lack of remorse. Right after those commands, quote, all smiles stop together, the plural smiles refers to the Duchess's cheerful disposition, which he's already described at length. By ending her life, he ends all those offending smiles permanently. The phrasing is really stark. It signifies that not only has she died, but also that any joy or warmth she brought has ended in that moment. It's a quote then that lays bare to the reader the Duke's tyrannical nature and that extreme exercise of authority that he wields. He treats a human life as something to be disposed of when it does not conform to his will. Thematically, it represents the ultimate conflict in the poem between the Duke's desire for dominance and control and the Duchess's free spirit, and it's resolved tragically by the Duke's abuse of his power. The line's concise structure, it's just two very terse, brief clauses, and the hard consonant sounds in stopped emphasize the finality and ruthlessness of his action. It is as if he's commenting on something trivial, which shows his disturbing lack of empathy. It's also a moment rich in dramatic irony. The Duke is bragging, or at least freely admitting this to the envoy, under the guise of sharing perhaps a cautionary tale, revealing his monstrous side to the reader, even if he thinks it's somehow proof of his sophistication or resolve or determination. It's a quote that cements the poem's critical view of patriarchal authority and pride. A nobleman so consumed by control and narcissism and vanity that he destroys his own wife to silence her smiles. It underscores the theme that behind polished manners can lurk cruelty and the corruption of absolute power. Immediately after this line in the poem, the Duke rather nonchalantly moves on to talking about a statue, Neptune taming a seahorse, reinforcing again just how casually he treats this grave and serious matter. Thus, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped, is the dark heart of My Last Duchess of the poem. It's the moment we fully grasp the Duke's character and the horrific extent of his dominance.